This scale that you might be handed in your average doctor's office is not necessarily perfect. It's being updated. It's being reconsidered.
Does that invalidate my diagnosis? What is going on?
There are people out there who are trying to figure out how to improve the burden that is being put on those of us who are getting diagnosed. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Research Recap. Today, we are talking about what it looks like to actually go behind the lines a little bit of the screeners and the diagnostic processes. Like for most of us, we've usually been the person receiving the diagnosis, receiving the screener. And so what we're doing today is we're really going to talk a little bit about how those screeners are made and how they're adjusted. Because I think sometimes with people, we don't necessarily realize how much controversy, how much conversation goes into how we actually apply them. And you might have found, especially if you're somebody who got a marginal diagnosis, that whether you were on the has ADHD or doesn't have ADHD side of things is somewhat in flux. And I think that's really interesting to discuss. And that's what we're going to do today.
Let's get started.
Yeah, so the first paper we have is called Determining Cutoff Scores on the Conners Adult ADHD Rating Scales that can definitively rule out the presence of ADHD in a clinical sample. And this is, of course, from this year. And what they were doing was they were aiming to identify cutoff scores and figure out what it was that really rules out whether somebody has ADHD or not. So Sarah, tell us what the demographics were.
So they were looking at students, 2 or 4 year students in Ontario. The age spread is quite wide, 17 to 56, but that's okay. And these were all people who were either referred for new or updated assessments. It's really interesting because really they were trying to see if they could avoid sending someone through a full comprehensive neuropsych evaluation based on this cutoff score that they were looking at. Very cool. So one thing that's good about this study is that all of the people were assessed through either a clinical psychologist or a supervised grad student. They had some pretty severe exclusion criteria. If you were taking stimulant meds at the time of diagnosis, you were excluded from the study.
They didn't want people who already had it?
They didn't want it to mess up the symptoms.
Oh, interesting.
The severity of the symptoms presenting. If you had a previous diagnosis of ADHD but no longer met that clinical threshold, you were excluded. And I'm going to be totally honest. If you failed a performance or symptom validity test, you were also excluded. And I only kind of understand what that means. They included some of these tests to see if people were just chronic over-reporters.
That's interesting.
If the symptoms didn't make sense, they would just exclude to prevent those people from skewing the results.
Are you telling me that they excluded hypochondriacs?
Yes. I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, they just say, out of an abundance of caution, those who demonstrate a strong tendency to overreport symptoms were removed from the current sample.
Yeah.
That's all they say.
That's so interesting. That kind of reminds me of something. And sorry, I say that the hypochondriac thing as a person who went through psychology and was like, I have everything. Cool. Note it all down. But you know what? I had a couple of things, so I wasn't 100% wrong. And it is interesting, this idea, because it makes me think a little bit about the diagnostic process in general. When you come to a psychologist or someone like that with a fistful of information and you say, I'm pretty sure I have ADHD or something else, that's why I'm paying this exorbitant amount of money to you. I'm not here for fun. And so I have all of this information that I have found to back this up because I know I only have an hour. And people, not everyone, but some people go, it seems like you really want this diagnosis. And maybe that is a tendency to overreport symptoms. And I do wonder about that. That is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, they talk about later how one of the limitations of this paper is obviously self-report bias, especially in the student population who may be seeking accommodations and stimulant medications. I read that and I was just like, wow, I wasn't expecting. I mean,
the shade of the academics. Yeah, well, I mean,
it probably doesn't never happen.
Yeah, it doesn't never happen, for sure. So it does make sense.
It would be nice to read it the other way around for a change, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we do. We get some lovely papers.
Yeah. It is interesting, though. It does beg the question of why they actually chose the student population, given that they don't trust their own population. And they're doing self-report study, which requires a trust of the population pretty implicitly.
Wow.
You're like, burn. No. It's just curious. It's just curious.
Yeah.
I mean, we know why. It's easier to study with grad students. Like, so many things are done with grad students.
So they came away with 550, 448 of which are non-ADHD, and then 102 of which were ADHD. 68 inattentive type, 31 combined type, 1 hyperactive type, and 2 unclassified, which again, they don't mention in more detail. They ran some like statistical analysis and found no significant differences between the gender groups. So that's cool. Yeah. And then, you know, they were really looking at the Conners Adult ADHD Rating Scale, which, you know, has several different parts.
Yeah. Do you want to take us through the Conners a little bit more? Because I feel like that is relevant. Do we have a version of that scale?
Don't, but I can see. Ah, okay.
Nice.
Wow. That was locked up tight.
Good job, Sarah. Freeing the scales from the shackles of academic
Oh
systems.
my goodness. Yeah, I don't even know if this is the exact thing that we were looking at. I suspect that it is.
Let's look at it.
Anyway, the Conners scale is sort of on that 4-point, like, this is not me at all, or wow, oh my God, this is totally me. And then
that's exactly the thing we do when you do a first session with us, we give you a scale with the exact same system. That's very cool.
Yeah. And then it asks you questions like, I like to do active things. I blurt out when I'm talking. I don't plan ahead.
I get down on myself.
Yeah. Driven as a motor. That one always makes me panic. But essentially, it's 66 items all like that.
Yeah.
And then the way that they're scored, sort of they have like the total symptom scale. So there's the number of like all of the symptoms that you have combined. And then they look at just the inattentive stuff and then just the hyperactive questions. And then you get a score for both of those. They weren't able to measure the hyperactive scale in the study because there was only one friend.
That's interesting. So what did they find then when they looked at the scale?
No individual diagnosed with ADHD scored below a 44 on the total symptom scale. And that was with 100% sensitivity. Interesting. They decided not to go with a 95% because of the possibility of a false
positive. Yeah. 100% sensitivity is very intense. Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely. And then they were looking at the inattentive symptoms specifically. And if you scored below a 54 on the inattentive symptom subscale, that you would not be diagnosed with inattentive ADHD.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So you could not receive a diagnosis of inattentive ADHD if you scored below a 54 on the inattentive subscale. It's a better way to say it.
They also said the ADHD index was found to be a poor predictor of a negative ADHD diagnosis. What did they mean by that?
Yeah, so that means that the ADHD index was not good at all for determining whether or not someone had ADHD. And they talk about this specifically.
And the ADHD index, can we just clarify what that is for people who might get lost, like myself?
Good idea. Yeah, so the ADHD index is one part of the CARS scale.
Okay.
Basically, the ADHD index measures the overall level of ADHD symptoms.
Okay.
And somehow that is distinct from the total symptom scale, which is created from the sum of the inattentive and the sum of the hyperactive symptoms. Somehow. So the ADHD index, they go on to say, is a specific grouping of questions that are weighted evenly. And so there's something about it that just messes up the analysis in this case. We talk about it more in the results section.
Yeah.
We know that ADHD can feel overwhelming and frustrating, and that's on a good day. And we don't want anyone to have to navigate that alone.
That's why we created the ADHD Academy, where adults with ADHD can meet, join, share stories, and support each other in a judgment-free way. If you want to connect with others who truly understand you and learn research-based strategies to help you feel more in control and build momentum in your life and work, you found the right place.
Together, let's transform your ADHD challenges into strengths. If you'd like to know more, you can click the link below to join us in the ADHD Academy.
Hope to see you there. So I guess in that case, they wanted to identify the cutoff scores that rule out the presence of ADHD. And they did find it. They found that below a value of 44 for ADHD symptoms, total scale, and below a value of 54 if it's inattentive systems, subscale.
They were looking specifically to see like what parts of the scale are good at ruling out ADHD, because the CARS has been studied in the past. And again, it was highlighted that the ADHD index is a bad predictor. So they tried to look at specific parts of this scale to see if there was some value in it, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely.
Long story short, there was.
Yeah. No, that's good. And so, I mean, it'd be bad if they were like, and it has no value, never mind. So I guess in terms of their long-term strategy then, this is kind of, I guess, the point of this paper for them was to figure out what the value was and how it works. But the point of the paper for us to discuss is really to highlight the fact that this CARS scale or other scale that you might be handed in your average doctor's office is not necessarily fixed and perfect. It's being updated. It's being reconsidered, which feels intense if you're somebody who used it as part of the diagnostic process.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think I have any experience with this one, but it sure calls into question, like, does that invalidate my diagnosis now? Like what is going on? Are they going to start to say that at some point,
Yeah. We're not necessarily saying this to say, hey, panic, like go and look up the latest research on your diagnosis system because it might have changed. But also to sort of say like, hey, like if you were marginal, on one side or another when you got your diagnosis or things like that, like things can change and things can adjust and systems get updated. It's worth just keeping that in mind. Because I think often when we're doing these kinds of diagnostic processes, it can feel very like you're in or you're out.
Yeah. And you might unfortunately wind up in front of someone who doesn't actually know what the next step should be. Say you do score positively on this CARS assessment. They're not going to just diagnose you with ADHD necessarily. There's more work to be done. And if they don't know that, then
and it's one step, but it's a step that's being adjusted. And that actually leads us to the next paper, which is looking at something that is being done to improve detection of ADHD. So should we talk about that?
Yeah, I love this because, we talk sort of a lot about the subjective nature of diagnosis and the fluid nature of diagnosis and criteria. And that's great, but it's still hard for people to get diagnosed. And what are we going to do to solve the problem now in the system that we have, right?
Yeah, 100%. So this paper is called A Qualitative Improvement Initiative for the Detection of ADHD in an Urban Academic Safety Net Hospital. And it's from the Journal of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics, particularly looking at how to improve the detection of ADHD in a specific space, which Sarah will talk about a little bit more in a second, in Boston, actually. So yeah, take us through how they did this, it's a very cool study.
Yeah, so I was very curious what a safety net hospital was. And so, they explain it a little bit in their introduction that, they serve mostly minorities, people who are on like our version of universal health care, and these are people who were presenting for evaluation sort of for the first time. This is a proper quantitative study. They were just looking at numbers here. Like, it makes it very neat. So their study group was 170, but then they also had a sort of control group. They just looked at the data from the previous year and compared it.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty cool. Oh, and they were only looking at kids 6 to 11.
Yeah, which is quite intense. Like 6 to 11, that's like the beginning of when you can even get diagnosed with ADHD.
That is true. Especially the form that they were using is the Vanderbilt ADHD Diagnostic Rating Scale, which has a parent and a teacher component.
Oh, interesting. So it was one of those like, does your teacher think you're a problem in class?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Now, I want to flag the study period because they were looking at pediatric checkups between May 1st, 2019 to March 1st, 2020.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
The initiative was halted at that time due to COVID. It also kind of impacted their ability to receive some of the results, which, is a limitation.
Yeah, definitely. But it's still good to see this. So we wanted to talk about what it was and what it did. So what were the changes that they recommended?
Yeah, so they met, they did a committee. They were like, what can we do? And basically they came away with 4 things. So they wanted to automatically flag a positive, like, it's a specific form that's given out in the office, and it's meant to like check for depression and attention problems. It's called the Pediatric Symptom Checklist. Basically, if you flag positive on that, the system is going to automatically trigger a workflow, which is going to give you a letter and coordination, like release of information forms between providers and the teachers. And then also they tried to develop a decision-making algorithm, but that didn't work. Yeah, that's not part of the results, really.
Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting. That's interesting that didn't work. So, but they wanted to create a workflow. So what was it about the workflow that made it better? Was it just that it was going to help you get more people to be evaluated?
So the idea was that if you flagged positive on this one screener, then it was going to automatically tell the doctor that you need to be given this other one. And it's going to automatically send it to your house if the doctor acknowledges that. And then it's also going to send you, the parent, the release of information forms, like I said, so that the school and the doctors can talk to each other.
Yeah. That's really cool. And it's funny, this is sort of similar to what we do in coaching, actually talking about improving systems and how to make systems more streamlined. It's interesting to see a discussion of what I imagine must go on internally all the time, but it might not be as obvious to those of us who are doing these things. We're on the patient side, that if there is no automated workflow, then maybe you don't get tested for what you need to be tested for, even though you met a criteria that would pick that up and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, they had grander plans for this. In the States, we also have these like digital platforms for managing medical stuff. You can make appointments, you can upload forms, sign forms, and that sort of thing. And they had hoped that the parents would sign up for that and would return the forms in that way, but they didn't. They suspect it might be because not all of them were native English speakers.
Yeah, interesting. That's interesting. Okay, and then what were the limitations of the study? Because there were quite a few.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, okay, so obviously there was a low sample size. 500 is pretty
Mm-hmm.
small for measuring something like this. The biggest limitation is obviously that the study was terminated early and it impacted the parents' ability to return that second screener form.
Yeah.
Did they ever even get it back from the teacher? Could they?
Yeah.
Were they going to mail it?
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Again, they list low utilization of that online platform. They say that these results may not be highly generalizable, which I'm now realizing we actually skipped the results section. We'll go back. Biggest limitation, though, is that they did not measure whether or not a diagnosis ever occurred.
So they're really just focusing on the process.
I guess they were. You know what? On one hand, I see that being a limitation, but then on the other hand, I see it as not being the desired outcome.
Yeah, no, because we're really focusing on the process.
Yeah, just making sure that everyone is evaluated and gets the care that they need, not necessarily whether or not. I still think it would have been interesting to know.
Yeah, definitely. They sort of concluded, which I thought was really interesting, that electric portals were the best way to improve diagnosis, to which I say, yes, please, yes. But I can imagine it became very obvious during COVID.
Absolutely. And I mean, here we are 4 years later, and I feel like AI can totally change this whole process.
That's very true.
We were talking about the diagnostic models and the predictor stuff. So like the decision-making algorithm, it didn't end up being good in 2020, but
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
I should mention that there were some significant improvements, whether or not this was charted in the patient's records, improved.
Yeah.
Statistically significant. It went from 41.5% to 65.3%. So that's great. It just tells me that there are some doctors out there who just don't like charting.
That's probably true. Yeah.
Also, whether or not the second screener was administered improved from 17.7% to 30.6%. So that means that like if you were automatically flagged, then it almost doubled whether or not you got the appropriate next form.
Yeah, which is, oh my gosh, so important.
Just because of a simple computer saying, hey, read me.
Yeah. Check this person might have ADHD. No, that's very cool. That's very cool. And I think a really good reminder of the very basic, seemingly basic updates to a system we can make that just allows everyone to more easily get the support they need. We talk so much about the more complicated things, the brain scans, the genetic scans, but at the end of the day, sometimes it's just about having a form that gets sent to somebody that says, hey, maybe this person should be tested because they did this other thing.
We didn't even mention the logistical load that is on the person being assessed. Oftentimes, it is fully us. Like, we need to come in and say, hey, I think there's a problem. We need to make sure that we make the appointment, schedule follow-ups, return the form on time. Definitely don't spill coffee on it.
Or lose it or just throw. Yeah. I have a terrible habit of taking pieces of paper and just shoving them in my pocket or somewhere and being like, that's a receipt. I don't need that. It's like, no, it's not. It's an important piece of paper.
And then even like if your kid has to get medication in school and they have to take it during school, the burden that fell on me was just like, are you kidding me? And it can feel like that a lot. There's a lot of systems out there that are like designed to help us, but that are still really exhausting for us. And I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned that at some point because I'm tired just talking about the process.
Definitely. And I think, that's why, because this episode is an interesting one because you might think, oh, this is a strange episode. We usually do like working memory and things that we can do. And that's very, very true. But sometimes it is nice to talk about the actual systems in place and what they are or are not doing to support us. And, also to end on a more positive note, there are people out there who are trying to figure out how to improve the burden that is being put on those of us who are getting diagnosed and see what they can do to make it easier. And I, for one, am incredibly grateful for that.
Hear, hear.
Definitely. Okay, well, that is everything for today's research recap. Thank you, as always, to our wonderful team, to our wonderful podcast producer, Sarah, and to Adam and all the other members who make this possible. We will see you next week for another episode. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reach out or connect with us, you can leave us a message at admin@unconventionalorganization.com.
You can also find out more about our ADHD coaching organization, read our free articles, or sign up to our online courses at unconventionalorganization.com. That's organization with a Z or an S. They both will get you there.
If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed here today, or you want to read the transcript, you can find that at our show notes page at unconventionalorganization.com.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and think someone else might find the strategies and stories helpful, the best thing you can do is share episodes using the share button in the podcast player, or leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or your podcast player of choice, letting them know why you've benefited from this podcast.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back in the ADHD lab next week.